All right, can everyone hear me? All right, so we're ready to begin. There's maybe about an 8 to 10 second lag between when I say something and when you'll hear it. So just a few things before we begin. First of all, if you have any questions during any part of the session, just ask. Don't worry about interrupting me. I'll see your question and I'll get to it soon. Make sure that you take advantage of the fact that this is live and that you can participate and ask questions. If there's something that I go over too quickly, let me know. If you get lost along the way, let me know so that I can go back over it in more detail. I'm going to try to proceed at a speed that everybody is comfortable with, and some people I'm going to assume maybe know about HTML, and so I might go through parts of HTML faster, and if you don't understand it, just let me know, and that way I can spend a little bit more time. Also, after this session, so roughly at about 10 o'clock p.m., I'm going to have an extended review where if anyone needs me to explain something in more detail, I'll be glad to do that. And tomorrow I'm going to have a recap session at 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern, where I'm going to go over the entire process from start to finish, how we got to this point. So we'll go through the whole process of setting up a web server, setting up Apache, and everything. We'll do that tomorrow at 4 p.m. So if this is your first time watching, I definitely recommend you watch tomorrow's session because it'll bring you up to speed without you having to watch 4 hours of YouTube videos. So there you go. All right, so the next thing is this entire process I'm doing blind. So I haven't pre-planned anything. I don't have, except for a rough idea, I don't have a plan of how we're going to proceed. So the idea here is that you get to see the process that I go through just as if this was a real job. And that's what I'm trying to convey here, is what it's like to actually work as a professional developer and the thought processes and so on. So first of all, one thing that I've done is I've registered the domain livecompsci.com. That way, instead of just going to IP addresses, we'll actually be able to use a real domain. In fact, we'll be able to use subdomains later on. So instead of www, we'll have testing. We'll have development. And so on, so that you can see how that works. I don't know if we'll get to that in this session. We may or may not. And you may not be able to pull up livecompsci.com on your own computer because it may or may not have propagated yet. Domains usually take a while to propagate, and I actually registered this domain today. So it may or may not be available to you. And that's it. So let's go ahead and begin. All right, so first of all, I have my screen session open here, very similar to what we had in the last session. And first, we're going to start with a brand new index.php. And for right now, that's just going to be that. Basically nothing, a blank page for right now. Now remember that we set up our htaccess file so that anything you type into the URL bar is going to go to index.php no matter what it is. So for example, if I type /test/123, it's still going to pull up the index.php page, which you can see. If I go back to that URL, you'll see it says test. And that's the basic concept of the framework, is that every single thing, every URL is going to pass through a controller, in this case this index.php page, and the index.php page is going to control how the content gets delivered, no matter what that content is, even if it's a JavaScript file or something that you have an actual path to. So for example, if I create a file here, let's call it test.txt. Now you can see here that the file exists and it says this is a test, but if I try to go directly to that file, you'll see that it didn't bring up this is a test because it's still going through the index.php, despite the fact that I've put in a URL which goes to a real location. So That's the basic idea here. Now the reason we're doing that is because this way we ensure that every part of the process is controlled by the controller. And when we say MVC, that's Model View Controller, and the controller is the part of the process that will handle the session, determine whether someone's logged in or not, what they should see, what they should have access to, and it will also determine how to load the correct files and content for that session. So let's go ahead and begin here. Alright, so one of the things that we're going to need is a basic template for an HTML page. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a directory called templates, and we're going to create a directory inside there called HTML, which is where we'll put our HTML templates. And let's just create a really basic one here. Let's just call it content.html. So here we're just going to write a very basic HTML page. Oops. Okay. There we go. So there's only, actually I should make one more change here. There. Okay, so notice that we have several places in the file where we've put braces. So we have head, title, content. The idea here is that later on we're going to have the PHP script actually fill in these spaces with real content. So for right now, let's go back to our index.php. And for right now, let's just output that content. So what we'll do is we'll say file get contents templates HTML. What did I call it again? Let's go find out. Content.html. Okay, see what happens. Okay, so if I view source, you'll see that I have exactly that. Nothing's been changed or filled in or anything. It's exactly the way I set it up. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a templates class. A very simple thing here. I want to emphasize this. I'm not going for making the best framework possible. I'm going for something that's beginner friendly here. So the idea is I want you to see how this is done in general, but if I was trying to create something that's very optimized or ready to be used at an enterprise level, then it's just simply going to be at a level that is not beginner friendly. So keep that in mind as I'm doing this. Now, whenever you view the source of a page, what you see is the HTML, the JavaScript, and the CSS. You do not see the back-end scripting. You don't see the PHP code, or if the back-end is in Python, you won't see the Python code and so on. Whatever the back-end happens to be, you won't see that when you are loading the page up in a web browser. You'll only see HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Alright, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and start filling in some of this content. So to do that, we're going to need to create a class. Now, let's start by creating a class. We say the keyword class, and then we give it a name. I'm going to just call it template. And now, for right now, I just want you to think of a class, for right now, as a collection of related functions. We're going to expand beyond that, but it makes it easy to understand. So I'm going to have a set of functions that are relevant to the process of using a template. And one of the most obvious functions that I'm going to need is going to be the function that's going to find something like brace, title brace, and replace it with actual content. So what we're going to do is give that function a name. I'll just call it assign. And Now it's going to be sent. We have to think about how we're going to be using the assign function. So here's the idea. If I want to make the title of the page something, suppose I want the title of the page to be "This is a test page," then I need to write some line of code that's going to actually do that. And I need to think about how that line of code is going to work, how it's going to look, and then I need to make it so. So here's what I would probably write. I would write template, assign, and then I'm going to say title with "This is a test page." That's the idea. Now, in order to be able to do that, we need to make the function now accept two parameters. We needed to accept a parameter of what's getting changed and also what it's getting changed to. So this is very basic at this point. So let's do that. We're going to say, we'll call the first parameter source and the second parameter content. And then the next thing we need is what is getting changed. So we have $file contains the entire contents of the template, so we'll put that in as an extra parameter for right now. Oops. Yeah. Okay, so besides content, we also want the file, which contains the whole HTML content that's going to get changed. So then what we're going to do is we're going to say file equals string replace source content file. Pretty simple. It'll get a little bit more complex later on, but for right now, let's just see what we get. Okay. And let's see let me see something here. Okay, so what am I doing wrong? Probably having a syntax error in my string replace function. I don't need $file. That's what it is. Nope. Replace. Yeah, I'm going to look it up real quick. Search, replace, subject. Okay, well that's exactly what I'm doing. Oh. No, wait, that's right. Okay. No, wait. Yeah, searching for source, replacing with content file. And it's returning a string. Okay, so it should be $file equals. So what gives? Okay, well it is, okay, so it is working. It is changing it. I probably have an echo that I don't want. Ah, of course. Okay. Try that. And now echo. Alright, let's try that. This is a test page. Okay, so there you go. Now it works. Few notes. When troubleshooting something, always start at the basic assumption. Whenever you're troubleshooting something, you have to realize that in your mind, you did it right. And so one of your assumptions has to be wrong. And so start with the basics. Display the variables you think you know what they are. Display them. See if they turn out the way you want. And then check your syntax and see what it is. In this case, what it mainly was is I just simply wasn't returning the variable and assigning it to $file. My string replace function was correct. Now another way I could have done that is I could have passed this by reference with an ampersand there, but we'll get into that later. Alright, so for right now, we have the basic process of changing the content in the template using a function called assign in the template class. Now there's one other thing I should do here. This really is being used as an abstract class. And the difference between an abstract class and a non-abstract class is that you see how I'm calling the function with these double colons, which is actually called a scope resolution operator. I'm not creating an instance of the class. I'll explain what that means later, but that's why it's an abstract class, and we'll get into that later. But if this wasn't an abstract class, what I would have to do is I would have to create an object from the class, which is called instantiating it, and then I would have to call that function from the object. In fact, just so you can see how that works, let's do it. So you've seen an abstract class. Let's imagine this was not an abstract class and we were going to do the exact same thing. Here's what we would do. I would have to give it a name. I could call it template equals new template. Ideally, this class would have a constructor, but we don't need to worry about that. And then what I would write is I would say, instead of this line, I would write this. I would say $file equals template assign, and then everything that is here. And it will function exactly the same way. As you see, it still says this is a test page, which means the title was set the same way. So there are many differences between how you would use an abstract class versus a normal class, and we'll get into that later. But the main thing that I want you to understand right now is that you don't instantiate an abstract class. You just use it as is, and you call the functions directly using the scope resolution operator. Alright, so one of the things we notice here is that when we're creating these placeholders using these braces, one of the things we would like to do is have a function that understands the braces are going to be there. We wouldn't really think of it as brace title brace. We would think of it as title. So when I run a function like that, ideally I want to do it like this, which is a little bit easier to understand intuitively, where I'm saying assign the title to this is a test page, and that means I would have to change it up here and put the braces in. Now, save it and confirm it still works as expected, and it does. Alright, so that's the first step. Now let's go ahead and assign the head to just be nothing for the time being, and the content to maybe have just a short message. Now before we do that, I don't like the idea that every time I run this template assign, I'm going to put $file equals. I want to just be able to run it like this. So that means I'm going to need to do this. And what this does is it ensures that I'm sending $file by reference, which means that when $file gets changed inside here, it's going to change it outside of the function as well. Like you see, it's still working. So now I don't have to write the $file equals because it's just done there. So now I can do this. So I'm going to replace head with nothing, and I'm going to replace content testing. Okay, so if I hit enter and we view source, you'll see already this is where the $, or where the brace head was, which is now replaced with nothing. Then we can see the title of the page is filled in, and we can see the body of the page is filled in. So we're well on our way. Now the next thing I would do is I would look at this and I would say that maybe I want to have another function which can do multiple assigns based on an array. And maybe it would work like this. I'm going to write the code first and worry about how to make it work second. Let's call it assign array. And we'll make it work like this. Title, this is a test page. head blank and content testing. Alright, so let's think about how that's going to work. We're going to go through each element of the array and call the assign function. So let's go ahead and create that function, and we'll get rid of this for right now. So it's still going to be part of the same class because it's still a function that's relevant to the process of templating. And you can see now one of the reasons you use classes is because it allows you to organize functions that are related. That's one reason. So we're going to call this assign array. And we can see here that this is going to take a parameter which will be the array, and we probably also want it to take the parameter which is going to be the file. Now, there's one thing I need to do here. This is going to be an array. And then I also want $file. So those are the two parameters I'm going to send. I'm going to send an array of what's going to get fast assigned, and then $file. Alright, so let's do that. So we're going to have array, now let's call it assign array. Assign array and file. Alright. Alright, so how is this going to work? Well, we're going to go through each element of the array. For each is a nice function for that. And I'll show you exactly what for each does. You'll see it in practice. And I'll say for each assign array as key value. Okay, so what does this say? This says go through the entire array, one element at a time, and keep track of the key and the value. Now, what is a key? What is a value? Real simple. This is a key. This is a value. So every time we go through the array, $key and $value will correspond to whichever iteration we're on. And you'll see that because I'm going to make it actually echo the process. The key is, and the value is. Okay. And let's go ahead and take that out for the time being. Okay. So now you should be able to see the inner workings of that function. Okay, so here you go. The key is title, and the value is this is a test page. The key is head, and the value is blank. The key is content, the value is testing. So now what we want to do is for each of these instances, we're going to run a string replace. So what we're going to do is we're going to say file equals str replace. Now immediately I notice that I'm going to need an ampersand here, or I'm going to have a bug. String replace, and we're going to need the brace key, and replacing that with value. File. And now if I echo file at the end, I can uncomment this echo. Oops. There we go. And run this. And there you go. So now we've written a new function that can assign many things together as part of a single array. So now we have two interesting functions. We have the assign function for if we have a single thing that we're wanting to assign, and we have assign array if it's more than one thing. We can take that out. Okay, so the next thing we might want to do here is we're looking at this and we're saying we have a class called template, which is something that we're going to want to keep separate from the rest of our code just for organizational purposes. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to select, and I should explain how I do that. Since this is Vim, I hold Shift and I push V. That enters visual line mode, and I can go down and select all of it. I can push D to delete it, tab new. Now I'm in a totally new file. Now I can push P to paste it all in. And now I can save this for the time being, I'll just put it in var www.html slash, let's call this class.template.php. Okay. Notice that I did not end this file with a question mark greater than sign. You can, but the advantage of not doing that is you don't have to worry that the file ends in a blank line. And this is actually something that is recommended at PHP, PHP's own website, php.net. When you have this kind of a file, you shouldn't end it with a question mark greater than sign. All right, so there is our basic template class. Now the next thing I need to do in order to make sure that our main index.php function works correctly is I need to include that class. So at the very top here I'm going to put require once, and we'll just call this class.template.php. If we did everything right, this should still work. And it does. Alright, so now the next thing we're going to want to do here is have dynamic HTML content that can be loaded in. And what I mean by that? Well, if we look at the source here, we've kind of hard-coded everything. We have a title that's hard-coded, we have the content, the word testing, which is hard-coded. We're going to want to have a way to have other templates that contain HTML code that we would put there. So let's go ahead and do some of that. So if I go into the HTML directory, I have one called content.html, which looks like this, and this really can be thought of as any HTML page we do will have this basic layout. So let's go ahead and create a new one here. We'll call it basic content.html. And let's just do something interesting. We're just going to say there, just for the fun of it. Now the idea here is that basic content.html can be loaded into our page anywhere we want, and it functions the same as the other template does, and so we can replace the value of text with something else. And let's take a look at that. So here we're going to want to, let's say that instead of replacing content with the word testing, we want to somehow replace content with the contents of that file. Well, how would we do that? We could do it like this, for example. File, get contents, templates, HTML, basic content.html. Okay, so let's start there. Oops, I don't need a semicolon. And try this out. Okay, and there you go. And you can see the, and if I view source here, you can see that it's been placed right where we told it to. And now, how would we fill in the word text with something else? Well, we could do this. Let's see. I think that what I would want to do here is create a new function that's going to, rather than assign a single value, that's going to assign based on the contents of a file. And so let's think about how that function would look. We would want to say something like this. We would want to say template, maybe assign file, and we would want to give it certain parameters. We would want to give it the key. Let's say in this case the key is going to be content. We would want to give it the file, and oops. And then, of course, later on we're going to want to have a way to let this file have its own template elements that we can assign. So let's go ahead and create that function, assign file. So we'll create it right here. Assign file. So, whoops. So we have the key and we have the file name. All right. Whoops. Whoops. Okay. Now we're not just going to do a simple string replace of the key with the contents of the file. We want to process the contents of the file. So I think we want to have a way of doing that. So how do we want to do that? Let's do it like this. Actually, let's also send an array. So we're going to send the key, we're going to send the file name, we're also going to send an array of assign values. We'll call this assign array for right now. And the idea is that this assign array can contain other keys that we're going to change. So for right now we'll just do it like this. Assign array equals array text testing. With the idea being that this instance of the word text is going to be transformed to the word testing once this gets processed. So that's the idea here. Alright, so let's go back to our assign file. We know now that we're going to get a third parameter, which is the assign array. And now let's think about how this is going to work. Well, we're definitely going to do a replacement, which means I'm going to need to send that also as a parameter. Like we did before. Alright, so got to put that here as well. Oops. I just noticed I put the ampersand over there. I did not mean to. Okay. And now we're going to do first the string replace. And just the same as this. We can even just copy and paste this for right now. Except instead of $value, we're going to want to have a for each that's going to go through all of assign array. So let's do that. For each assign array as key value. Okay. Before we do that, let's see. Thinking about the best way to do this. All right, let's take a look at our parameters so far. When you can look at what you're working with, the data that you're working with, it often helps you to visualize how you want to proceed. Now, when you're looking at an array, it's good to use the print r function. Okay, that should be enough. Let's just see if that runs. Okay, view source. Alright, so I can see when we get to this function, key is content, this is the file name. We want to replace content first with this file name, and then after we do that, we want to go through and assign text to testing. Alright, so let's do it like that. So first of all, $file is going to be a string replace of key with file get contents of $file name. That's step one. And then step two is this. That looks good. Let's see if it works. There you go. All right, now what if we had more than one? What if we had more than one element in this basic content.html file that we're working with? Well, then we would do something like this. All right, let's have an H1 and an H2, just for the fun of it. We'll call this text2. And now here, let's modify our array we'll call this another test. Okay, there you go. Now, you might be wondering why we're doing that, and the answer is that H1 tags and H2 tags are very basic examples, but we can also do the exact same thing with forms, for example. We can do the same thing when you have a checkbox or a pull-down menu. We can have a way to write the code in PHP and generate HTML. And let's go ahead and do a little bit of that. So here, let's change our basic content. In fact, let's get out of that. Let's create a new one here. We're going to call it basic form.html. All right, so how does a form look? Well, we have form, we have a method, we have an action. For example, it could be method equals post, action equals the URL that you're going to submit it to. We're going to have a /form, and then we're going to have form content, which could be things like input fields and so on. Oops. So now we have the basic structure of how a form tag is going to look, and we can actually start building a form. So let's do that. If I go back to the PHP code here, let's create something called form array. And what we'll do here is we'll say that the method equals post. We'll say that the action equals, let's just say, index.php. And we'll leave form content. Let's just create an input field for the time being. Now I can't remember exactly what I called it, so let me take a quick look here. Form content, okay. Form content. And we'll say that that's just going to be blank for right now. All right, and now, instead of sending basic content, we'll send basic form. We don't have to change any of the other code, And now we can get rid of this. So we have form array, method action, and form content. So instead of assign array, we'll call this form array. $file. It should work. Let's try it out. And it didn't work. Probably have a PHP error. Line 16. Oops. Let's try it now. Okay. Okay. It's not loading up our form, so why not? Let's just take a look at our variables real quick here. Let's see what that does. should be changing content to the contents of this page. All right, let's just check that page. Okay, so why not? I put this little dash dash greater than sign here just so that I can see. I need it down here. Just so that I can see when I view source exactly where it's echoing that particular value. And it's not. Okay, so I'm probably not sending file correctly. Let's see. Because this is not actually changing anything. Sign array. This is a test page. Okay, so this is fine. Alright, so I'm a little confused. Why is it doing that? This is fine. So the problem has to be here. Key, file name. Am I returning? Well, it's not even echoing. It's not... Wait a second. Okay. It's not running this code, it looks like. I don't see this happening. Ah. Okay, now it is. Oh, of course, because content's already been changed. That's why. So why has it already been changed? If I comment this out, what do I get? Yeah, there's nowhere for content to be because content's already been changed. That's why. Because of this. And that would explain it. Alright, so let's try that. Oh, there we go. There's our form. Alright. So that was the problem. I was already changing content in an earlier line of code. But there we go. Alright, so going back over here, I can go ahead and delete this. Alright. So if I load this up and we go view source, you'll see that I have my form and /form exactly the way I had it before. And of course there is the form content is blank, but let's go ahead and change that for right now. We'll put something there. We'll just create a simple input field. There. And now, there you go. Alright, so this is just to give you a rough idea of how you can use a template in general in order to start building the different pieces of a page, of a site. We're starting very basic here, of course, with forms, and we'll get into more later, including design elements, CSS and such. But let's go ahead and talk about something else. Let's create a basic CSS page here, and let's talk about how we can make it actually work. So if I go over here, let's look at our content.html, which is the basic template of any web page. Where would we put a CSS entry? Well, we put it right here. We would have the CSS line of code that specifies where the CSS file is going to be right here. The problem is, even if I specify a file name and we try to go directly to it using the URL, it's not going to work because everything is going through the index.php page. So that, I think, is the next thing I want to actually cover here. So let's go ahead and do that. Before I do, though, does anyone have any questions up until now? Okay, so let's go ahead and proceed. So first of all, if we had a CSS file, it would be, we'd have something like this. We'd write link href, then we give a name for the CSS file. Let's have css/style.css, which doesn't exist yet, but we'll create it. And we're going to say that this is a style sheet, type equals text CSS. Alright, so we're going to start there, but keep in mind that when you try to load this URL, even if we did create the file, it's not going to work. It's just going to call index.php. So let's go ahead and make this actually work. Let's go ahead and first of all decide where do we want our CSS to go. Well, for right now, let's go ahead and create a directory in templates. We'll call it CSS. Oops. And we'll go ahead and edit this style.css. For right now, let's just do something really basic here. Just do that. And for right now, let's go ahead and, all of this is for demonstration purposes right now. I'm just showing you the basics of how everything works. Let's go ahead and take all of that out and just worry about the CSS file. So first of all, let's echo the request URI. Now we're going to imagine I went to /css/style.css. Alright, so the first thing we notice here is that we're calling a URL that begins with /css, so we want to have our controller understand that. So we can start by doing something like this. If this is going to just simply say if it starts with CSS, then we want to treat this differently. And what we want to do here is file get contents template CSS. For right now, we'll know it's style.css, so we'll just hard code it. We'll change that later, and then echo file, and then die. We don't have to do anything beyond that. Let's see what happens. And obviously, I've got a PHP error. Line 5. Oops. There we go. Okay. So notice here I have the line that says echo server request URI shows this part, and then I have the actual CSS from the file. Now we're getting into some of the details of how the controller is actually going to work. It's going to be able to interpret what you put in the URL in order to determine how to handle that session. So in this case, if you put /css, it's going to locate the correct file and display it to you, even if that file isn't actually in a /css directory. You'll see that come in handy more later. So we know now that this works. So because that works, we can actually go back in time here and go back to where we had everything that we had before. I just pushed U a bunch of times to undo what we just did without first copy pasting it. Let me copy paste that. There. Now we can go back in time to where we were, and we're just going to put, for right now, we're just going to put that up here. So let me be clear here. Before proceeding, check if this is /CSS. So if the URL is /CSS something, this is going to execute. And if not, then it'll proceed here. So this happens only if the URL is not /CSS something. Alright, so let's go ahead and load up the index page here. And notice the background. The reason the background is off-white is because of our CSS. And when we view the source here, there it is. Now if we wanted to, and we should, we could have a simple HTML snippet for what the CSS code looks like here and use that in our framework. And let's go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to push Shift Y to yank this line, tab new, P for paste. And now we're going to save it in css.html, and now we're going to change a few things here. The /CSS will stay. CSS file name. We'll just say file name. And there you go. So all you'll need to do is just specify the file name for this. Yes, definitely don't have caps lock when you're working in Vi or Vim. Alright, so now if I go into the template/HTML directory and I look at this, I have the css.html, and if I look at that file, it's basically a placeholder here. And here we go. Let's see. Alright, so first of all, let's just refresh this page. Well, actually, oops. Okay, so here where we have the link href, we're going to take that out. We're going to leave head where it is. We'll take this out for right now. And we're going to use the assign file function. For right now, we'll just do it this way. Now I need to build my CSS array, which is only going to have one piece to it, which is the CSS file name, and that's just going to be style.css. Okay. All right, let's see what happens. There it is. Now, just to make sure that it actually works the way I think it does, let me comment that line out and hit refresh again. And there you go. Okay, so you can clearly see that the head placeholder is being replaced with the contents of the css.html file, and that the contents of the CSS file is properly replacing CSS file name with style.css, like you see. All right, so we've done quite a bit in this session, and I think I'm going to open it up for questions and answers now. But before we do, I just want to recap some of the important highlights of what we've done. One of the things that I'm trying to demonstrate here is how you can have content with placeholders which will have dynamic elements that are filled in later, and how you can use that in order to almost build it like a jigsaw puzzle, where you have a function that creates a form here, a function that has your CSS here, and you're actually writing it in PHP, but you're generating HTML. And this is something that applies not only in web development, it applies when you're building any software. Whenever you're working with a data format of any kind, you're going to basically write your program in such a way that you're going to say, certain data goes here. And then you'll put a little placeholder there, and later on in the program you can fill that in, or you can figure out what goes there. And that's something that I'm trying to convey. The other thing that we've done here, which is significant, is even though everything is going to index.php, which is our controller, we're now able to actually load URLs like this one, /css/style.css, and even though it's going through the index page, it's actually pulling the correct content up here and displaying it. Now, this is going to become more sophisticated later on. But one thing I want you to notice is that even though the URL is /css/style.css, that's not where the file itself is located. In fact, the file itself could be constructed dynamically with multiple CSS files. And I'm hoping we'll get into that later. The same thing is true with JavaScript and even the HTML. So what you see here is generated with the PHP code, and yet it looks like a single HTML page. And that's how web applications work in general. You're going to, whenever you view source, you'll see what looks like a normal HTML page that was written exactly like that, but it's actually built behind the scenes. So with that, I'm going to open this up for questions and answers, and if there are any parts of what I've explained that are unclear, that you would like me to go over in more detail, I'll do that after the questions and answers. So there you go. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and ask. That's a good question. Well, first of all, the challenge that I have here is I'm trying to explain something that is usually done in a more sophisticated way at more of a beginner level. And the gist of what I'm doing is realistic. It's the way it actually is done. If you're going to a specific path, you're usually not locating a file on the server that happens to have that exact same path, that happens to have exactly that content. It's dynamically generated and dynamically routed behind the scenes. That's especially true when you're logged into a site and you have a members area or something like that. So the gist of what I'm explaining is absolutely the way it's done. The methods that I'm using are still somewhat not as sophisticated as they will get. But we're going to get into that. And I'm starting to explain this step by step. I want you to see the process. And I'm also trying to formulate the thought process that leads us to that point. Any other questions? Now, one of the things that I'd like to do is, I know that I go through some parts of this fairly quickly, and even if it was a prior session, if there's any part of this that I've gone through, maybe how to use Vim or something like that which you don't fully understand, then let me know and I'll be glad to go into that in more detail if there's any part of this that isn't fully clear. Ideally, everybody who has watched these sessions up until now should be able to do what I've done. They should be able to create a basic page which works like this. They should be able to create a basic template system like what I've done. That's where you should be. If you're not there, then feel free to ask questions and I'll explain in more depth. So any other questions? I will be doing that, but not yet, because right now I'm more going through a demonstration process of roughly what you do, but we really haven't started building the actual framework yet. I'm kind of explaining the pieces that we're going to be using, and that's why the code that I've done up until now isn't published. But I will be doing that. And also keep in mind, tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern, I'm going to go... yeah, I hate that. Tomorrow at 4 Eastern, I'm going to have a recap session where we're going to start from scratch, set up a whole new server, and go through the whole process of everything we've done up until now. I'll go through it somewhat quicker, but I think that will help also to solidify your understanding, so I definitely recommend you tune in for that. Yeah, it definitely is. So any other questions? Also, let me know if there's any part of this that you want me to demonstrate, or maybe something related to this that you want me to demonstrate. The whole idea here is that this is live, and I definitely want you guys to take advantage of that. If you have any questions about how any of this is done, or you want to see something demonstrated, ask. This is the time. Okay, so let's talk about tabs in Vim. If I type just Vim, enter, I don't have any tabs. If I want a tab, I type : tab new. That gives me a tab. If I push GT, that's just GT, like that, it'll switch between tabs. This is just me hitting GT a bunch of times. If I have several tabs open, and I want to switch to a specific tab, I push the number of the tab I want, followed by GT. So 1 GT will put me on the first tab. 3 GT will put me on the third tab. Now let's get out of that and something else. Let's suppose I want to edit both of these PHP files in tabs in Vim. That's something I will often do. I do vim-p star.php. And now it'll open both of these in tabs. Another thing that's nice is, let's suppose that I want to edit all of the .html files that are in all the subdirectories here. So if I do a find /grep.html, this, well, I should do grep.html. Okay, I put the slash there because the dot has to be escaped. This is the escape character. So this shows me the 4 files that end in .html. If I wanted to edit all of them inside Vim, what I can do is just push the up arrow where that command is and push vim-p and then enclose this in tick marks like that. And if I hit enter, there you go. And now I have all of the .html files open as separate tabs regardless of what subdirectory they're in. Very useful. Another thing that you can do along those same lines is, well, let's say I did this. Let's create a file here called vimfiles.txt. And I'll put test.txt here, I'll put index.php here, and I'll put templates, HTML, basic, let's see, what did I call it? Basic form, I think, .html. All right. Now, let's do this. Cat vimfiles. Okay, so let's oops, I forgot my -p. And so if I have a specific set of files that I want to open, maybe even on a regular basis, then I can just save those files into a little text file, and then I can open them all in Vim in tabs, just like that. And I can add to or take away from that file. So Vim works great as an IDE because you can create different lists of files that you're going to work with. Yeah, and one other thing too about Vim is if you're in Vim and you want to open a specific file but you're not sure where it is, you can push :E, x, and then you can go and actually select the file. There's also some nice add-ons to Vim that make that process a little easier, but we haven't gotten there yet. Other questions? Sure. All right, well, first of all, we haven't gotten into any JavaScript yet. And whenever, let's say we have a framework that's going to actually produce a form. One of the things that form is probably going to have is some kind of a verification process to make sure that what you typed into the form is valid. No invalid characters, or if you're typing in an email address, it's going to check that you have a valid email address. So the general idea here is that with, in this case, a single line of PHP, we're going to produce a fully functional form that'll have all of the CSS, all of the JavaScript, all of the HTML together. That's what the real world is. The real world is you write your line of code and it generates the entire thing. Whereas right now we're really just kind of focused on the HTML. But what we're going to have is we're going to have CSS for forms, we're going to have JavaScript for forms, and then you'll be able to build the form in PHP, and you'll probably have something like this. Let's just, for example, maybe you'll have something like this. Build form where you're going to give the form a name, and maybe this is a, I don't know, login form. And maybe just the fact that you typed in login form as a parameter means that the form itself is going to have a real nice title and a border that'll say login form at the top, where it'll actually generate the HTML and CSS to do that. And then maybe here you'll have, you know, an array of the different items for the form, and so on. So the idea here is that when you're developing in the real world, you want to be able to create a completely working thing, whether it's a form or content or whatever the case is, very quickly. And the key to that is having the functions already built that are going to do that. And we're going to be doing that. That's the idea. I mean, through the course, we're going to eventually reach that point where we can create a fully functional, nice-looking form anywhere we want, just with a single line of code. So that's one example. Now, another example is when you're talking about logging in. Now, I was actually hoping we'd get to that in this session, but we weren't able to. But when you're logged in, you're going to have different content available to you, different ways to interact with the site available to you when you're authenticated versus when you're not authenticated. And the framework, one of the purposes of using a framework, one of the purposes of the framework itself is to be able to check that you have access to what you're looking at. And so it's going to say, is this person logged in? If they are, what's their access level? Do they have access to look at this? And then determine what to show you. So that describes a little bit of the gap between where we are right now and where we'll be. Other questions? Anyone else have any questions? All right, then I'll go ahead and close this session. So tomorrow at 4 o'clock PM Eastern, I'm going to have a recap where we go through the whole process. In fact, I'm going to terminate the server, take everything offline so that I'll be forced to actually go through the whole process of rebuilding everything from scratch. And we'll do that tomorrow at about 4 o'clock, maybe 1 to 2 hours total in length. But the goal is that at the end of tomorrow, we'll be here. So at 5 or 6 p.m. tomorrow, we'll be back at this exact point, so you'll be able to watch the whole process from start to finish. And meanwhile, if anyone has any questions, just shoot me a PM. Of course, on Reddit, I'm Carl H. And there you go. So I'll see everyone tomorrow.